joy once again as we're well into our second year of Harlem Speaks to look around this room and see some faces that we know and more importantly some new faces. This thing is really taking off and it's all because of you. It wouldn't happen without you. My co-director is Christian McBride, and on behalf of him and our board chairman and our board of directors, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. This evening is an extra special edition of Harlem Speaks, and you'll find out why in just one moment. Before we get into this evening's presentation, I would like to tell you about some very exciting news that we've had, and that is that we are starting our educational initiative. My co-director will be conducting the interview this evening, Mr. Greg Thomas, who you all know. Greg, everyone knows Greg, will be running a program under the auspices of the Jazz Museum in Harlem and the Gilda Lehrman Educational Foundation at the Frederick Douglass Academy. And we will be featuring various folks who participated in Harlem Speaks over the course of the year and hopefully for the next several years. We're very, very excited about that and many, many other things that are happening too. We're also making really great headway towards getting a physical home for the museum. And it looks as though we'll be designated with a major site in Harlem to be the cultural component and a major site coming up very, very shortly. So, enough of the preview. It's my great pleasure to introduce my co-producer for the series and again the leader of our educational initiative, Harlem Speaks, Greg Thomas.
Thank you, Loren. Well, it gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest for this evening, Mr. Herb Boyd. Thanks, Greg. You're very welcome. So let me start by saying that I have known this gentleman for at least a decade, probably more. And I started writing as a journalist in the early 90s, and I want to reveal to you all that one of my models, one of my icons as a writer and a journalist, particularly as a journalist, is Mr. Herb Boyd. So I'm very honored to be here this evening. And I mean that, Herb, because I've been reading your byline for years before I started. And you were writing with the Amsterdam News long time before you were writing for the City Sun. And you were writing for the City Sun around the early to mid 90s, and I happened to be around there too. So I was up close and I just have to say this. I say this, I've written this about him, and I'll say this about him, even though I won't use that word that we talked about, indefatigable. He's one of the most tireless writers and journalists around, period. I mean, you'll see his byline in the Amsterdam News, more than one story often, and if you pick up other publications, you'll see him there too. So let me ask you this first, Herb.
Yes.
On average, how many stories do you write in 1 week?
Well, it depends. It really depends. The thing about it, I'm writing about what I know, and it makes it so much easier. You know, sometimes you jump into some water that's not so familiar, and it takes a little bit more time because you got to do your homework, you got to do your research. I pride myself on being accurate, honest, as truthful as possible, as fast as possible. Get it out there. I recycle a lot of information, Greg. I mean, people say, how do you, not only with the writing, but also, I mean, you got your journalism, but I also have my books.
Which we will get to.
Yes, indeed. Mm-hmm. And there's the teaching. And there's the activist. And there's the husband. So I have a number of roles to play, and thankfully, many of them are tightly related. So it makes it very easy. As a journalist, you know, you're out there. For me, journalism is like the first draft of history. So you're out there on the front line, and you're covering all these events. So being here in New York for the last, I guess going on 20 years, you know, and working ostensibly with the Amsterdam News, it's put me right on the pulse of things happening in this community Also the Bronx and Queens, the Staten Island and Brooklyn too, the People's Republic of Brooklyn, we cannot forget that. So, and from a political, cultural, and economic standpoint, and historical, it's been my privilege to cover a wide beat and a large number of stories out there. And so once you get the journalism, and then you let it fossilize or you go back or crystallize and go back and cannibalize it and put it into a book. And then you take the book into the classroom and torture your students with it. Right? So it's like, it's the same information. It's primary source. I get primary source material, I think, following Al Sharpton, for example, for the last 20 years. It's put me right there on the activist tip. I mean, I came to town. When I hit town, it was two things jumping off out there. Of course, L&L Bumpers and Michael Stewart had just been killed, victims of police excess, misconduct, brutality, right? So I jumped in, and of course, right behind that came, the Howard Beach situation when Michael Griffin was killed there. After Michael Griffin's death, of course, even before that, well, just after that, I think it was Bernard Goetz. So I got involved in the Bernard Goetz case. So it was like one incident after another. So that gave me a lot of primary source material, just covering, the various atrocities committed by the NYPD. And then I began to branch out, and I was writing for the National Guardian newspaper at that time also, very fine radical weekly. And
Where are they based?
Excuse me?
Where are they based?
They were. It's a defunct, extinct now, but it was one of the leading. It came into existence after World War II. Cedric Belfarge, a very fine journalist, along with people like John Tinkle, and I hooked up with them. Robert Allen and Julius Lester and Phil Hutchins. Those were the black writers who were connected with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the urban extension of that was pretty much housed at the National Guardian newspaper. So I used to read them a lot. I grew up in Detroit, and I used to read them a lot when I was in Detroit. It was always my wish that if I got to New York and had to write for a radical newspaper, it would be The Guardian. And once I got here, and Akinji Ola, who was also one of my favorite writers, I used to read from afar, and I became a very close friend of his, So he kind of introduced me to the whole leftist, Marxist, radical community in New York City, and gave me an opportunity to write there for that newspaper. So The Guardian, but all of just about every black major publication, once I got here to New York, I knew that I can go around and knock on these doors and let people know I'm here. Many of them had heard from me out in Detroit, because I had done quite a bit of journalism from there. Writing for the Black World. Just lost John A. Johnson. And his first publication was called A Negro Digest. Some of y'all remember that, don't you? That became, in the 60s, Black World. And the editor there was Hoyt Fuller. And I was running around Africa quite a bit in those days. So Hoyt Fuller, he gave me an opportunity to write there and, covering the struggles, liberation struggles in Africa. That was my primary beat there. And also in the Caribbean later on. All this was an extension of a grant that I got at Wayne State University. I was teaching at Wayne State University beginning in 1967, and I stayed around there a good 10, 12 years. And that was like my base of operations. So a lot of people knew about my activism around Wayne State University, the Black Studies, a whole drive we had for that, the campaign to take over the country's universities, as we did from San Francisco State all the way to Howard University and all the stops in between there. Ostensibly at Oberlin and Antioch, Kent State, Wayne State University, Ohio State, Michigan State. So all those were like hotbeds of black studies. So I got to know all of these academics. So I was operating all these different fronts, Greg. I had the activist friends, I had the musician friends, and I think that's pretty much the topic of the moment, huh? And all while I was doing this, I was very much involved in the cultural scene. At Wayne State University, I started the Jazz Research Institute and got on. Well, Detroit has just got tremendous number. I mean, Larry, you know about that. I mean, the number of musicians that have come out of Detroit. I mean, Leonard Feather had a book called, you remember, Loren, Encyclopedia of Jazz? And I went through there one time, and I counted all of the musicians who at one time lived in Detroit or was born in Detroit. and it comprised nearly a fourth of the book. It's amazing. It has some kind of connection with Detroit. Matter of fact, I just discovered the other day with the death of L. McGibbon that he grew up in Detroit. So even at this late date, I'm still learning about musicians who have this connection with the Motor City.
For those who might not know him, for our archives, L. McGibbon, tell us who he is.
Who,
Or
L.
he
McGibbon?
was, yeah.
L. McGibbon was a very fine bass player. Very fine bassist. He virtually played with everyone. You talk about the big names.
Al McKibbon.
McGibbon.
McKibbon.
McKibbon, right, okay. Right.
And he, his most famous residency, I imagine, was with Dizzy.
And George Shearing.
George Shearing also.
Yeah. So, with coming out of the whole bebop period, and also was an innovator. Many people don't know, but he was one of the prime movers in the whole samba, the whole bossa nova coming from Brazil. He was very much a part of that when people like, certainly Stan Getz, when he heard João Gilberto and Antonio Carlos Jobim and Louis Bonfa and all of these fine Brazilians. Al was one of the first to really pay attention to that music and help introduce it in this country. So the whole bossa nova wave, he was one of the principal prime movers there. So a very fine bass player, and of course we lost with Keita Betts, another fine bassist out there. I guess we can go on and on with the recent losses we've had, in the jazz community. I was looking at
Percy Heath,
and Joyce Ween, just recently. So we've had quite a few setbacks there, but the music, it continues, it lives. We got a number of living proponents, this great music, in our very presence here.
Yes,
Glad to see them here, huh?
Talk about Melba Joyce.
Melba
of
Joyce,
course.
that's right.
One of our first Harlem Speaks honorees. Well,
Just finished doing her liner notes on her CD.
all right.
Oh yeah, that should be.
Okay. Now
Wait
you
to see
mentioned.
it.
Mhm, I'm
I
sorry.
wait to hear that.
Absolutely. You mentioned various, I guess you can say, hats you wear, and we will touch on all of them.
Koofies. Right, wrong, koofy.
And you mentioned one. I think the last one you mentioned was that you are a husband. So I'd like us to take this moment to have you introduce your
Oh, sure.
beloved wife.
Certainly be a pleasure. She's my companion, my partner, my editor, my cook, my cook, my cook for days. You got to come and check out some of these vegetarian specials, and she is like par excellence. And most importantly, my wife, who takes care of me. And if I can get something past, let me say this here. I write quite a bit. And I write so much that sometimes she cannot see it all. But whenever I write something that is significantly important, in terms of having a long longevity, particularly my books, if I can get it past her, then I know I'm halfway there.
All right.
Because she's one of the best editors and a fine writer in her own right. She has something out, 11, 12 books out there. She's a dean at the College of New Rochelle. So another thing, she's my boss.
Oh, all right.
And then she
Multi
is right
roles
there.
here. All right, let's give her a hand. Not their support. Okay.
We just recently, we got married in Harare, Zimbabwe. What, 1986, honey? And so, even before that, when we were struggling at Wayne State University back when we were kind of like upsetting the whole university there, demanding black studies. She was one of the prime movers there in that whole struggle, and eventually ended up being standing right next to me as we made all these demands in terms of curriculum change, demands for African and African American studies. She was right there with me. So actually, we go back to the early 70s, 1971, 1972, when I first met her. So we've been comrades for a long time in this struggle for black liberation.
All right, let's give her another hand. Okay, now let's go back.
Go way back.
Way back.
Take me back.
All right. So you were born in Detroit?
No.
Where were you born?
Like a lot of folks, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama.
Birmingham, Alabama.
Birmingham, Alabama. Yeah, I heard that.
All right.
Birmingham, Alabama.
And
Dynamite Hill, in fact, but I didn't spend that much time there, Greg. I was out of there. My mother took me, my brother, and skedaddled from actually Tuskegee at that time, because we moved. I was born in Birmingham and Hillside Hospital and everything, but then she was living down in Tuskegee. So after about 4 years there, then we followed that general migration period, kind of a straight line migration from Alabama to Detroit, where she was had already gotten a job as a domestic, and shortly thereafter became like a black Rosie the Riveter. A lot of people don't know. They see Rosie the Riveter during World War II, you know, putting all these tanks together when they weren't making Fords, Oldsmobile, Chryslers, and what have you, you know, making tanks and military parts. So she was a part of that, working at Packard Motors, and then eventually at Murray Body. So she was, you know, once the war was over, she had to return back to being a domestic servant, which she at some, approaching 85 years old, and she's still doing that kind of work. She figures that if she stopped, man, she'll stop, period. So she continues to work, you know, as a domestic, worker, and a very fine cook herself, and an expert in salads, which you do at the Sherry Sadak, you know, one of the Jewish synagogues right there, and out in West Bloomfield in Detroit,
all right.
Michigan.
Okay. So, do you have siblings?
Excuse me?
Any siblings?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I got one brother and a sister. My brother is a retired police officer, and my sister is a CPA.
Okay. And
I need her sometime, too.
I hear
believe
that.
me.
And where are you in the siblings?
I'm the oldest. Yeah,
The oldest.
I was first out, you know, running around out there. And in fact, I had another brother who was killed in 1983, I pretty much raised my little brother and my little sister. It was like some big generation gap between us, but I was essentially involved in their raising. And in fact, in raising them, I began to teach myself a lot of things. Kind of slowed me down because I was pretty wild. I was moving 100 miles an hour, you know, speed of light all over the place. But having them, they slowed me down, and particularly at home in the evenings when I had to, you know, really entertain them. And that's when I used to gather my James Baldwin and gather my Ralph Ellison and get together my Richard Wright, get my Zora Neale Hurston, and my Grimm fairy tales and everything else, just to entertain them. But they really preferred, you know, they loved, like, I read them Black Boy when they were kids, you know, and they were just absolutely fascinated with that, you know. I guess, like me, they saw a bit of themselves there, you know, because they were just 8, 9, 10 years old when I started to really get where I could read to them beyond, you know, fairy tales and stuff like that. So just babysitting them was an education.
I bet. And what kind of music did you hear around the household?
Music?
Yes.
I grew up watching my mother iron clothes a lot. And whenever she got to that ironing board, almost invariably she would cut on the radio or the Victrola, the record player. Right.
What? The what? The what?
This age of
Record
CDs
player?
and DVDs. Victrola. His master's voice, RCA Victor. But anyway, she would put on these 78s, and my goodness, I would watch her iron those clothes, and she had a certain kind of rhythm, and she would get into like Savannah Churchill, you know, Wynonie Harris, you know, and she would get like Bull Moose Jackson, and then she would Eddie Cleanhead Vincent, you know, and she would be stroking, and Diana Washington come in there. But the two people that I think she was in love with was Nat King Cole and Billy Eckstine. She wore out Billy Eckstine. I mean, that's 78. After a while, you know, hey, Lewis, the needle starts sliding across it. No more grooves to catch, you know. And she must have had about A Prisoner of Love. She did that one up. I mean, she must have had at least 3 or 4 copies of that.
All right.
And I think the only person she really wanted in her life more than Billy Eckstine was probably Sugar Ray Robinson. She loved Sugar Ray Robinson. And I know when I was doing the biography of his life, which is one of my recent books out there, it's called Pound for Pound, the biography of Sugar Ray Robinson. And I was just thinking about her and doing certain chapters of the book, just remembering how much she, on the Friday night fight, she'd be right there. My mother's a sports addict. I mean, no one could talk baseball. I mean, I got some friends who are like ex-ball players, and when I was coming up, like the Detroit Tigers, when they won the pennant in 1968, this is right after 67 when they destroyed the city. You know, then 68 was kind of like, you know, the Tigers won the World Series and everything. And in fact, there's HBO did a very fine production called City on Fire. And I was a part of that. So I was able to reminisce about that period of time in which, you know, we were very much involved, you know, in like pulling the city back together again. And so I was just thinking, like, you know, that whole period of time was a very rich period, 67. If I ever read a book, it's going to be called 1968, because that was a very critical cultural, I mean, 67 was devastating for me as a culturologist, because we lost, Langston Hughes, John Coltrane, you know, I mean, those are two of my real heroes. And I guess later on we can talk about some of these people who have had a very positive impact on my life. But anyway, I think my mother had this here fascination for the music. But what I wanted to do, after a while, Greg, I began to isolate the bands in back of the music and beyond the singers. I mean, I love the lyrics. You know, I used to collect lyrics and knew all the songwriters and what have you. But when I was listening to like Billy Eckstine, he had this fantastic band, you know, in back of him. And after a while, I began to listen to their solos and memorize the solos and everything. And then I would say, I wanted to hear some more of that individual musician. So I would go out and get their records. I mean, my goodness, you know, you hear these magnificent musicians. So if you listen to Lloyd Price, even back in those days, you know, with Lordy, 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 Miss Claudie, you know, back in there. Even if you listen to the music, back of King Pleasure, you know, the bands that used to be kicking back there. So I began to isolate these players. In the same way, if you listen to Motown music, if you listen to like the Supremes, and listen to the band in back of the Supremes, sometimes led by Teddy Harris. We just lost Teddy Harris, the very fine musician who was part of that jazz connection to Motown. He was just he'd be turning 71, I think, in another month or so. We lost Teddy Harris.
What instrument did he play?
He was a multi-reedist as well as a very fine pianist. His father, Teddy Harris Sr., was a very fine blues player. So Teddy came by this year musical legacy, inheritance, genetically. I mean, he was cool. He was just a beautiful musician. And he was one of those musicians that's kind of emblematic of these Detroit musicians who were like part of the Motown explosion, at the same time were ensconced, you know, in the whole Detroit jazz scene. Because when I was listening to my mother's music, you know, this is like rhythm and blues. So you have these kind of categories out there, you know, separated off here. I mean, the jazz musicians and such were very much a part of this here rhythm and blues thing. I mean, we used to listen to like Louis Jordan and the Timpani Five. I mean, all of these begin to characterize and represent the kind of cross-fertilization of the music that was happening at that time. The kind of like the heavy categorization that later, for marketing purposes, which I guess we can talk about later, came, you know, subsequent to that period. So my mother was the beginning of my musical development in terms of giving me quality music that I heard all the time, you know. She was being moved for, I guess, the same reasons, and she really was very much a lover of words, and she loved the lyrics. She knew all those songs, you know. Didn't have a very good voice, but she knew those songs, and I could talk to her about the music, and she would explain to me, and she would bring home the magazines and everything. So after a while, she kind of improved and expanded my interest in the music. You know, beyond just listening to it, you know, you can read about it. You know, magazines she would bring home.
Like what magazine?
Like Metronome. The first time I ever saw, you know, a jazz magazine, she brought it home. Because she worked for all these different people, and she would bring home just about everything they would throw out. I mean, I got shirts. I was wearing Van Heusen shirts. I would go to school, I had some Van Heusen shirts and Ben B. Burke shoes. They said, man, what's going on? My mother would bring all this stuff home. Sometimes the collar's an arrow shirt. The collar may be a bit frayed, but still, I did label, man. Check the label. Check the label. And check the label in the shoes and everything. So she, and then of course the Reader's Digest, Cosmopolitan, House and Gardens. One of my favorites that she used to bring home was the romance magazines. I used to love those. I would read all of the stories in the romance. And later on, I began to buy them myself, like Tan magazine. Again, it's another Johnson publication. It was a Johnson publication. You know? So I would say I was a very good customer.
Yes.
You know, and, of course, Jet and Ebony all the time. And then, of course, now and then, Negro Digest. So she got me hooked on magazines. She got me hooked on the music. She got me hooked on words. She got me hooked on just learning. Because she was like, she got 8th grade education. That's all she ever got, you know. But she was an inveterate reader, and she had these great ears, and she could like pick up and remember all kind of things. She had all of these here folksy things she used to say. I remember as a kid, I ended up saying, "Where there's a will, there's a way." Because I was listening to all these little short phrases that she would say, you know, and I remember them, you know, little sayings. And that's how I taught myself languages too. I would just learn little short phrases, like I learned Swahili and Arabic and a little bit of Chinese and even some Korean, huh? But just learning short phrases, and then you get a feel for the rhythm, the melody, the harmony, the complexity of the language is because it's sometimes encapsulated in just these little small phrases. It's kind of like breaking it down, you know, like a bebop riff. Can you break down a Charlie Parker bebop riff and just learn that? Right, okay?
Right. And I guess, you know, you could say some of the wisdom, folk wisdom of different peoples are contained in those idioms, those idiomatic.
Exactly, yeah.
Well,
What's Anthony Braxton called it? The trans-idiomatic affinities.
Trans-idiomatic affinity.
Right. Anyway, big old fancy word. Huh, Ron?
Let's cogitate.
Let's cogitate on that, right?
Okay.
Well, that's to come back behind your indefatigable faggot.
All right. Okay.
Like Martin Luther King. That's how he started off, you know, with those kind of words as a kid. You know, he would raise his hand, you know, like his grandmother say, you are so rambunctious. And so he picked up on that, and he began to say, he said, how do you spell it? So he went to class, you know, one day and dropped that word on the teacher and spelled it and everything. So they began to get his fascination for words is evident right there. It's just a kid. You start picking up those things that would be like the nuggets, the building stones, you know, the blocks, you know, of your whole development.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned two things related to your... All right. That I want to take us into the history part of Her Boy a little
Yes.
bit. Okay, and we're going to flow back into the music. The music's going to be interweaved throughout as it is in your writing.
Exactly.
And I want to talk about that. But you mentioned how your mom, when she would be ironing, how she'd have music on in the background. And what I thought of was how back in slavery time, you had work songs.
Indeed.
You know. So I was just wondering, you know, if you could...
Oh yeah, that's a good point in terms of the relationship between the two. Essentially, ostensibly, you know, African captives was brought to this country to work. We're not brought to entertain y'all. You know, you go out there in the field and take care of work. But if you look at it from the standpoint of African, some people call them the Africanisms, in fact. Those kind of things that consistent with our African background that are just imperishable. I mean, there's no way you can wipe them out. Even when you talk about jazz, for example, the question is often raised, you know, is jazz dead or dying? And we're talking about something that it's almost amorphous anyway, and how can you get a hold on it to really kill it? You know, as soon as you think you got it, it's kind of transmogrified into something else, you know. And that's how I feel about a number of Africanisms. There are some things about our culture, the language in particular, that you can find, you know, evidences of the continuance, the African continuities, you know, right into the present day. Many linguists, you know, have done these studies. I think one good friend of mine, Dr. Geneva Smitherman, You may have heard of her, a very fine linguist, and she's traced and looked at some of these idioms and the evolution, the etymology of these words, and how you can trace them back to the African beginnings, and syntax and grammar and all those things that have like this African base, particularly in a Bantu context. She's done it well. Religion, you can do it. You can do it. Religion. Look at how I call it the syncretisms that happen as you move from the African source, and depending on what part of the world you go in, particularly the African diaspora, and see how that particular musical or religious or linguistic essence, has been transformed to a degree. Polkamania, for example, we talk about that, the ring shout. These are things going back to our African beginnings, where once they come outside of that, Shango rites, or the Vodun or voodoo, these are the kind of religious syncretisms that occurred later on. And of course, the merger of the Catholic or Christianity, or certainly Catholicism, and the African musical impulse is a very fascinating one, and I think you see that as pretty much the seed of the music, of jazz. You can see how these two things, the European impulse and the African context, how these things come together. That's another syncretism, in fact. So it happens in religion, it happens in language, it happens in the music, it happens in, even look at burial ceremonies. You can look at the ways in which our educational process, or look at the family structure, the extended family. That's another aspect of our African beginnings.
Mm-hmm. All right.
But of course, you're talking about the whole shout thing and working in the fields. Ossie Davis once did a very fascinating discussion on that, Greg, where he talked about the field shouts, the work songs, something that later on you're going to hear people like Oscar Brown Jr. does very well. Within the songs, he had these nice historical snatches, explaining a lot of things about our culture and our history and his music. And he talked about, the whole work song, breaking up these rocks on the chain gang. And right there, a certain kind of rhythm. I mean, Marshall Stearns talked about it in his book, The Story of Jazz. Amiri Baraka, at that time, Leroy Jones was talking about it in his book, Blues People, where they began to look at all these different kind of urgencies that was coming out of this African impulse once we're captured and thrown into this work-labor situation, and how if you don't solve the rhythm of work will work you to death. So they had to get inside of that, through their work, breaking up those rocks, whatever they were doing, rowing a canoe or working down on the levee. And so all of these work situations had musical escapes, you might say.
Right. I mean, I think that's true even today. I mean, there are folks who, on their way to work, in their cars, or on the train or on the bus, they got that iPod in the car, they rocking, they moving, they grooving, getting ready for work.
That's right.
Getting ready to
get that rhythm.
Right.
Gotta get that rhythm.
And the other thing that I that I thought of was, you were saying how your mother brought home the magazines, and that took me right to Ralph Ellison, because Ellison's mom would do that back in the early 20s. She would bring home Vanity Fair and publications like that, Esquire. Was Esquire out there? Writers who wrote about the music were influential on you. I mentioned Ellison. Ellison happens to be one of, Ellison.
Sure,
Ellison. Right. You mentioned about the African retentions, carryovers, syncretism, you call me a number of things.
Yes.
And one person that comes to mind is Albert Murray, who oftentimes people who are familiar with Albert Murray wouldn't think that he would talk about any African retention, but that is not true. Mm-hmm. He talks about the tendency of Black Americans to change all movement into what he calls a dance beat rhythm.
Yes.
That's an African derivation.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's inseparable, inextricably linked, dance and music, coming from an African and a number of other cultural contexts too, where you have this your relationship between dance and music.
And of course, they say dance was the first art. So everything they say comes out of dance.
Yeah. I always felt that in the beginning was the word.
Well, I think you're a little biased. You're a little biased being a writer, But if you're talking about John 1:1, well, say in the beginning was the word, right?
Right.
Okay. So who would you say what writers would you say were influential on you with regards to the music and jazz in particular?
And certainly, by extension, jazz criticism too.
Yes, and that's something I like to talk.
Very interesting that when I first heard about it, in fact, I saw the release that was on the internet, and I saw it had jazz criticism in there because we hadn't talked yet.
Right.
It called and everything, and I started thinking about jazz criticism. When did I first really have a conscious aspect of that? In 1968, there was a book out called Black Talk by Ben Sidran. Ben Sidran. And this is at the height of, this is like black nationalism and your Black Panther Party, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, the Republic of New Africa, the Shrine of the Black Madonna. The culture was, in Detroit in particular, was alive with all this here political ferment. And so the nationalism was, and the Pan-Africanism was like beating me in the chest all the time. And so we tried to put together Black Studies at Wayne State University. And one author that I started reading when I was about 18 or 19, because at 19 years of age, I was lucky enough to be in the company of like Malcolm X, So from that day forward, being at the Nation of Islam, Malcolm was like everything to me. And Malcolm knew a lot about jazz. You can read his autobiography, you can see the jazz that's just throughout the book. He's there talking about it in some form. And the dance too, Greg, in terms of the Lindy Hop. Mm-hmm. But anyway, one writer that was really influential in giving me some kind of cultural perspective was J.A. Rogers. J.A. Rogers.
Now, I want to tell who J.A. Rogers was.
J.A. Rogers was an anthropologist, historian, a raconteur, a boulevardier. This guy was so versatile, and he wrote all of these books and had to publish them all himself because no one could deal with the kind of topics he was introducing. Either they were too controversial or they just smacked with so much power and the destruction of white supremacy that they could not stomach it. So he had to go and publish the books himself. And he published something like 32 books, including As Nature Leads, Sex and Race, volumes 1, 2, and 3, from Superman to Man.
That was a powerful one.
Which is probably one of my favorites, and I've in several of my books, I've excerpted parts from there to show the discussion there between us when the black sleeping car porter, and this here fairly austere, elitist, arrogant white senator, and how the sleeping car porter educates him. And these are just some riveting, compelling discussions between the two. So J.A. Rogers was I kind of cut my eye teeth on him. One essay that he wrote in particular that is probably critical and germane to this discussion, he wrote a thing called Jazz at Home back in 1925. And Mickey, what was that? It was the New Negro, the one that Alain Locke put out, right? In that anthology there, which is really kind of a reissue of Survey Graphic magazine that came out, and this was like a white publication back in 1925. So they had a special issue which they allowed blacks to come in. And Alain Locke, the great philosopher teacher from Howard University, he was given editorial direction of that. So he began to round up all of his cronies, to put together this here particular special issue, which later became the volume, The New Negro.
Which signaled the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance.
Exactly. So you can see the significant seminal aspects of that for the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance. So many consider him kind of pretty much the godfather of the Harlem Renaissance. And this book is being the Bible of it. In this here particular collection was Jazz at Home by J.A. Rogers. Later on, when Ben Sidran did his book, Black Talk, he lifted that. He read that essay, he read that particular thing, and Lights a Low. You know that one, Larry?
When Lights a Low, Benny Carter?
Yeah, right. The old Benny Carter tune. So when Ben Sidran, who's a British pianist and historian and jazz critic and whatever, he put that, this book came out in 1968, and he had and he talked about J.A. Rogers. He called him a white jazz critic. And right away I said, whoa, hold tight. You know, that's the last person you want to call white is, first of all, J.A. Rogers, because he was so concerned about the African continuance no matter where we are. I mean, all of his books, you know, As Nature Leads in particular, you know, dealt with that particular premise. So here he is, I mean, Ben Sidran talking about J.A. Rogers, you know, being a white jazz critic. And I thought about it for a moment. I said, now, why would he arrive at that conclusion? I said, well, the assumption being there's no such thing as a black jazz critic in 1925. So he just assumed it, because I wrote to Ben several times trying to correct him on
Part 2 of our interview with our special guest, Mr. Herb Boyd. And we want to thank you once again for coming out and supporting us and showing your support of our guest, Mr. Herb Boyd.
love, some love.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so let's resume where we left. Yeah. Oh, yes. Of course, we are being. Excuse me. We are being joined by the executive director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, Mr. Loren Schoenberg. Thank you. All right. We're going to resume where we left off, and I asked you two questions.
Sure.
One had to do with this connection between writers, Black American writers in particular, and the left, and also about jazz and the Midwest. What makes the Midwest such a fertile area for the development of jazz?
Okay, first question. When you look at and certainly in my life it's been true, I had about 4 or 5 things that I just had to do as a kid. I had to have my music, I had to have my literature, I had to have my sports, had to have my sports, because at one time I thought that I would have a shot at Detroit Tigers. You know, I was really, couldn't hit the curveball. That was one of the problems, you know. But I had baseball on my mind, continues to be on my mind. I love baseball a lot. Basketball too, track, what have you. So sports had to be there. I had to have my music, my literature, sports. And then eventually would come in the politics, the whole activism. And I was surrounded by a lot of young people who taught me. I know when the whole civil rights movement was going down, I was pretty much in the military at the beginning of it. You know, of course, many people look at now with the Emmett Till situation out there as his death, his murder, being a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Of course, you cannot forget or ignore Brown versus Board of Education, as well as the 3 months after Emmett Till's murder, the Rosa Parks, you know, in Montgomery. So it's kind of a connection there. The point being is that, you know, if you look at the example of my life, as I got involved in writing, I guess I always had the James Baldwin thing happening in my life. I guess I used to carry in my back pocket all the time, if I could get it in there, you know, one of his small books like No Name in the Street, Nobody Knows My Name, and particularly the essays in there in which he talked about Harlem. Mm-hmm. So Harlem, those are the first images I had of Harlem. And always with Harlem was connected with the Harlem Renaissance. So those writers, you know, it was so, there were a proliferation of their works all across the country. So invariably you ran into them in some anthology. So like Ann Petrie, for example, and reading The Street, again, it put me in touch with like 116th Street. I could visualize, you know, exactly what that was, you know. And one day I was going to go there and see for myself, although it was a pretty wretched scene as she painted it. But it had a certain kind of musical vitality, at least as she talked about the nightclubs and everything. And that would be true later on as I read the Chester Himes. You know, you read like his books, Cotton Comes to Harlem, or Pink Toes, or
Which
Blind
turned
Man
into
with a
a
Pistol.
movie, right?
Oh yes, all right. Rage in Harlem also. So those kind of books again give me that contextual thing, that connection with that community. So you always had these writers out there, and if you look at Ellison and Wright, to some extent, Baldwin, Frank Yerby, Willard Motley, all of these writers, you know, who were coming just in post-World War I, between World War I and World War II, certainly during the Depression, when you had these writers out there who did not have any form of employment. So many of them were picked up, Loren, by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and they were part of the Federal Writers Project. So it has to be seen as germinal, as seminal, in terms of who are these writers who are connected with the Federal Writers Program. Many of them were on the left. They were coming out of the socialist and the communist movements in this country. I think I spent a lot of time with Gordon Parks, and Gordon was a part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. That's the CCC camps that they had, you know, during the Depression, and also provided work for a number of itinerant laborers and everything. So Gordon Parks ended up going there, and just hear him in his book, A Choice of Weapons, he talks about that experience. So again, you know, Gordon, I wouldn't necessarily say he was on the left as much as some of the others, because he had no political affiliation, but he had this capacity of moving around and being in touch with all of these other artists out there. And you cannot ignore the Jacob Lawrence. We can't ignore the Romare Beards and some of the painters and certainly the poets too. We cannot forget the poets and the playwrights that were going on. I pick up the life of Canada Lee, again, or Paul Robeson.
There's a new book about Canada Lee.
Yes, there's a new book out there. Yeah, Smith has done a wonderful job on that. And Canada Lee, for those who you don't know, was a very, very fine actor. Not too long ago, there was a film on the what was it? I think it was Turner Classic Movie, Lifeboat. And this is when Canada Lee is a black man on the boat. And this is a riveting situation in terms of like who's going to survive here, you know, and the ingenuity. Canada Lee was sometimes given some deplorable scripts, but he transcended these scripts. And in many a way of black actors going back, Rex Ingram was another very fine actor. And he was given these here lemons, but they made lemonade. You know, they turned these scripts around, you know, step invented even to some extent. Although, you know, you have to consider the limitations. You know, what Hollywood, what the whole publishing industry at that time, like how many writers are out there. So you had the Wright, Ellison, and Baldwin. They were kind of like the pinnacle, the three on, where were the black women writers at that time? You know, but we had a history of going all the way back to Frances Ellen Watkins Hopper, you know, Pauline Hopkins, you know, going all the way back to the, you know, turn of the century writers, where we had a number of black women writers who was expressing themselves. So, but later on when Ann Petrie comes along, she's at the same period, but she didn't get any kind of recognition whatsoever. And of course, you know, Dorothy West, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, you can't forget her, and Their Eyes Were Watching God. But this is all in 1935, 1936. But I think the left writers got a lot of play at that time because they were writing these big novels, and they had a lot of social realism embedded there. Richard Wright in particular, I mean, Native Son, when it came out, I mean, it rocked this nation. I mean, that's what, 1939, 1940. So you have Native Son out there, and later he would come out with Black Boy, who would be kind of the, well, one is the fictional, and the other is the non-fictional aspects, and how he brought these things together. He begins to personify the leftist writer, and eventually pressured right out of this country. By 1946, 1947, he's living in Paris. You know, so he hooks up with a number of African American writers who had fled this country as early as the 1920s. When we talk about Sidney Bechet, when we talk about Josephine Baker, you know, by 1925, Josephine Baker is the toast of Paris. You know, she's at the Folie Bergère. She's doing it over there. And you have these jazz musicians who are in and around her. So they begin to represent, to some extent, this continuance, you know, of this left expression that could not do here. Paul Robeson had to go abroad. He had to go abroad. There was no way he'd get the kind of work here that he wanted. So after like a sojourn in London and expressing himself on the stage there, he gets this here international reputation. So again, you have the left in the theater. With a Langston Hughes out there, Langston was always, you know, somewhere involved in one of these political formations. I think of the CRC, and talk about the this whole the Civil Rights Congress. This is with William Patterson, who later wrote the book, you know, We Charge Genocide. So these are Louise Thompson, who was connected with Langston Hughes and went to Russia in the 1920s, 1922, when all these African Americans went to Russia to make this film. You know, on the African American experience, only to be told by the Russians, we know more about it than you do. So, which was absolutely ironically crazy, you know, that they could know any more about our experience than we do. But anyway, the whole project flip-flop and never flew. So you have these left writers out here who represent for me the whole nucleus that later on you have the more popular commercial aspects of the commodification, and then later on into the civil rights movement, and extended opportunities for writers and everything. But I think the left, Louis Burnham, I think of Louis Burnham, people who were writing for a number of the publications of John Henry Clark. Just read Harold Cruz's book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and there you can get a full gallery, a litany of the writers who were to some extent involved in beginning as early as the turn of the century, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, you know, right on down into the 1930s with a number of these writers who were coming out of the Communist Party and the Socialist movement, who were part of magazines like Masses and Mainstream, who by the 1940s then, you know, just like Stretch Johnson was a very important individual, Howard Stretch Johnson. And Stretch Johnson, he was just a really unique individual because, again, we talk about three people straddling these worlds. He was someone who by day organized for the Communist Party, and by night he was dancing in front of the Duke Ellington Band at the Cotton Club. So this is in the 1920s, you know, and all these broadcasts was coming on NBC at that time. So they were broadcasting from the Cotton Club with the Duke Ellington Band there, and out front would be Stretch Johnson and his two sisters. So that's what he's doing by night. But in daytime, he's living right up there where we live on 146th Street between St. Nicholas and Convent. He lived right in that neighborhood and was organizing members of the Communist Party at that time to show his versatility and working both from a political and a cultural standpoint, you know. So that was that kind of like a nice connection and transition. Of course, a number of them did it, but not as well as Stretch. Okay. Stretch was remarkable.
Speaking of transitions, I want to bring Loren in.
Yeah.
I don't know if you.
I don't know why.
Take four, man.
I feel like I'm a piano player.
Take five.
I feel like a piano player at a jam session waiting to sit in with Art Tatum. There's no reason even getting near the piano bench because this thing has been rolling. And I don't know what to say, but I'll just ask a couple of questions.
Sure.
I knew Stretch Johnson, and the funny thing was that no one, whether as I experienced it, from my experience being a musician, in the jazz world, black musicians I knew, white musicians I knew, other musicians I knew, hardly anybody knew about his background or talked about him much because by that time there was a stigma associated with the left and with communism, and we actually sit down and talk to him about it. Well, the last time I saw him, he was in a wheelchair, I remember.
Yes.
And he was so happy to have someone to talk to, at least knew about it. But I have a few questions for you, because you've touched upon so many fascinating subjects tonight. One is, if you read Sidney Bechet's Treated Gentle,
Yes.
or if you read Willie Lyon Smith's Music on My Mind, you find out that for some of these folks, they may have been in and around Camp Unity and Barney Josephson and some of those left-wing camps. The degree of political sophistication and or real involvement in the causes, I'm not sure about. I had dinner last week with Paul Robeson Jr.
Oh, yes.
at Londell's, and we were and
That must have been fun.
it was well, as much as we could hear each other, it was a lot of fun. But we're having dinner on Saturday night and this Saturday night, and I hope to invite him to be our guest here too at some point.
Yes.
And he was saying how how his father was really much engaged. Most of the jazz musicians weren't, but the only one that I'm aware of who was really engaged on a substantive level with the left was Frankie Newton, who's the English writer, who's probably the last remaining Stalinist alive. Eric Hobsbawm took his name Francis Newton from Frankie Newton.
Right.
And I'm wondering of the people that you mentioned, whether it was Josephine Baker or the line of those folks, who were their legatees in terms of being involved with the left and
the movement.
Yeah, like, was there a Stretch Johnson of jazz musicians? Was there somebody who was actively involved?
Oh yes, there's quite a few of them. I think in working with Yusef Lateef, he points out quite a few of them, that he ran into that were very, I mean, even a Wardell Gray. I mean, people forgot all about Wardell Gray, but very politically conscious, you know, and available. Dizzy Gillespie, you know, in terms of fundraisers and everything that went down. I mean, they used to have these major bashes at the Roseland. I mean, also at the up here in Harlem at 4 or 5 places, including the Apollo. They would have these bands coming through there, and many of them had an appreciation for the left. I mean, even Bird, you know, Charlie Parker, you know, the musicians, you know, that would cling around him had these connections with various political formations, you know, in the country. Yusuf talks about even his own, you know, involvement, you know, where he was called upon to participate, to raise some funds for some kind of political cause out there. He was very much available. So it's you know, the singers, you know, a number of singers who, Dinah Washington, Sarah Vaughan, you know, they were very much amenable, you know, to working for these things and doing the working with Ray Robinson Jr., Ray Robinson III, on his father's book. We also discovered there were a lot of musicians that Sugar Ray Robinson was pretty much a pretty good musician himself. You know, I mean, he's a very fine drummer, and he could peck away on the piano a little bit. But he was also, they was asking him about his own civil rights commitment, and you found that he's a boxer and everything. Of course, Muhammad Ali comes along and raises the standard. But Sugar was opposed to what Eisenhower represented in the whole Little Rock situation, you know, the Governor Faubus there. And speaking of Governor Faubus, how can you forget Charlie Mingus?
Or Louis Armstrong,
Sure,
who was the most vocal opponent of those.
So he had him not hooked up in terms of the understanding the political movements in this country, and some of the lesser known ones. You know, I mean, when Max Roach, for example, when he came out with his freedom, you know, with the jazz suite and everything, the whole liberation quest in this country was like exemplified by what Max was talking about. So you very much, you know, had, I mean, if anyone had a political conscience and was raising money out there for the civil rights movement, because, and Miles Davis too, because Edna Mae Robinson had 2 or 3 major events in which she brought in, you know, Miles Davis. This was raising money for the Montgomery struggle. A lot of people don't even know that they had raised that kind of money, that was pumping it into with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier being the couriers, you know, getting this money and transferring it to SCLC in particular, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they were getting a lot of this money that was being raised, you know, during the Civil Rights Movement. So if you go back, there's a Civil Rights Movement, and during the liberation struggle period in the 1960s, it was far more pronounced. I remember, like, all of the musicians who were in and around the Loft days, huh, Billy? You know, had that kind of political conscience at that time. And Archie Shepp, Archie Shepp was like, you know, for me, you know, very much involved in a number of political activities. And more so, I mean, who was writing about it? You know, who had the essays out there? That was appearing in these various black publications. I remember Black World, when Archie Shepp wrote a brilliant piece there in terms of the need, you know, for the musician to get more involved in the struggle. And he kind of raised up Paul Robeson as being like a prototype of that, you know. I don't know, that's a pretty big prototype there, you know, to match the kind of commitment and the energy and the contributions that Paul Robeson made, you know. But I think we have a number across the history of musicians being involved, you know, actively involved in the political struggle.
I have one more question for you. You were a big part in helping us just about exactly a year ago, I guess it was, when we had Clarence Atkins here.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And I remember spending some time with him at that time with you at his house.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if we could get you to reflect on Clarence Atkins, because for our archives, you know, we are filming these things. I'd just like to just real quickly, because I was talking to someone in the audience, one of our friends, who was saying that, you know, she would love to have copies of these things for her grandchildren and things like that. I just want to just address that issue just real quickly as I ask you our question, which is that these things are for you. The videotapes that we do, they're not our property. We can't sell them because we don't have that kind of agreement with our guests, you know what I mean, that they're not for sale. I want to give them away. And so what we're looking for...
We can make an agreement. I don't know.
I knew if I laid that trap, somebody walked right in the door.
Have a lawyer here. Contract out.
No. We don't want to penalize anybody who can't pay for a DVD. So these things, we're going to find a foundation or someone to underwrite it, and we'll just give them away. They'll be in the Jazz Museum when it's built. We're starting to put online the transcripts of the interviews. But again, we have to cross our T's and dot our I's with all of our guests. There's several of them here to get the rights issue thing just squared away. I don't foresee any problems. And then we'll just give them, and that's what they're for. So having said that, we have the Clarence Atkins interview, and that will be part of archives. Now we have our Herb Boyd interview.
Sure.
Could you give us some information for what people should know about Clarence Atkins and what he meant to you and what he meant to the jazz world?
Well, when I arrived here, I started writing arts and entertainment at the Amsterdam News. Mel Tapley was the editor then, and he used to send me everywhere. I mean, where's Mel? You know, I'd love to have him back again to send me. I mean, on the theater beat, I got a chance to go to all of these plays and everything, to cover these plays. I remember the Hadley players, you know, being with them, and Delco, you know, hanging out with the Delco people, and Woody King, and going over to the Billie Holiday Theater. So Mel sent me all over the place. And then he started sending me to these, cover these jazz concerts. And each time I went to one, I would see this here man sitting up front, you know, taking down notes and everything. And one evening, I just approached him and I said, "Man, you taking copious notes here?" He said, "Yeah, I write about the music." And so he kind of halfway introduced himself and said, you know, that he was Clarence. I said, "Oh yeah, I've seen his stuff at Spotlight. It was Jazz Spotlight at that time. That he with Mr. Harrison, he was doing stuff there, and also in a couple of other black newspapers. I think the Beacon." You know, he was writing for them as well as the Daily Challenge. So I say, well, if I'm going to do anything on the jazz scene, I better make my entree in a very respectful way and honor my elder. And so he really respected that I approached him, and he introduced me to everybody. I mean, on the Jazzmobile beat, I mean, Clarence knew everybody, you know. Then later at JALC, Jazz at Lincoln Center, same thing. And so over the years, I grew to respect him. I spent a lot of time at his house listening to music because he had a collection that was just absolutely outstanding, and all kind of old and new music. So I would be right there with him, learning from him. I mean, we used to challenge each other, and who wrote this song, and who was this solo in this band, and I bet you can't finish this phrase, you know, and hey, I castle on you and checkmate you at the same time. So he was like, you know, hey, you know that tune? I said, yeah, I know all Tad Dameron's music. So he said, oh, okay. So he got a respect for me on that, you know. Plus, coming out of Detroit, you know, you have a certain kind of reputation coming from Motown anyway. Although the Motown music was something I had also in my heart, but at that time, you know, he wanted to know more about the jazz music. So one day we're sitting there and we're rapping hard. Somebody rang the doorbell. He said, came, opened the door. In walks, not Bud. In walks Betty Carter.
Oh, that was it.
And I said, what? You know, and she just kind of casually walking in like she was walking there all the time. You know, like no big deal. So I'm sitting there, absolutely. I hadn't seen her. My wife and I saw her, what was it, Ronnie Scott's in London, and here she come walking in the door. And I said, my goodness, you know, so we reminisced right then and there, and he started talking about how close she was to him, and she would come by all the time, and they had a kind of a, well, with Clarence, you know, you had to be ready.
What do you mean?
You know, Greg, I'm saying, you know, you step off the wrong way, and you're into a fight with him, you know, barbed exchange on stuff, you know. So I learned how to be very, very accommodating. I said, no, I ain't going to get on the wrong side of him because he would go out on you in public. But I saw him too many times, and toward the end, when he was pretty much incapacitated, he could not move with the same speed and alacrity as before, I would help him. And heaven helped that person who bumped into him. Yes. Whoa, he would just go off on them. You know what I'm saying? I came, he just go out. So I had to kind of be calm, everything would be all right. They didn't mean to bump into you. Raising his cane one night. I mean, literally and figuratively raising cane. So he was getting ready to whop somebody upside the head in Lincoln Center one night. I said, come on, Clarence, cool out, you know. So near the end, he got a little bit cantankerous and rambunctious, as you would say, and irritable. But at the back of all that was just this rich legacy and history of the music. And he could talk about it just in terms of that building he lived in, Dakota State. And he talked about, you know, looking out when he used to hang out with King Pleasure at Needle Park, you know, right on Graham Court. When he would talk about the situation with Johnny Hartman, living in the same building. So this building, you know, like 345 there at 145th Street, it just has such a rich treasury, you know, treasure trove.
Too, right?
Dinah Washington at one time, you know, so Jimmy Monroe, you know, the people who, Monroes, you know, as well as, you know, some people used to hang at Minton's. Well, Clarence was a fixture at Minton's. And I'm glad to hear that they're beginning to pull the club back together again and put in a whole historical installation and what have you, but that was his hangout, mostly to get Henry's chicken, you know, to hang there and eat that chicken, because right over there near the bar, you know. And so he's just playing those times spending there with Andy Kirk. That was another good friend of his. I mean, he was just like, you know, this here reservoir, an inexhaustible reservoir of information as it pertained to people he knew. You know, he knew firsthand. It's one thing to say, well, you could stand there and talk about, you know, he did a whole Count Basie band. We went through all the Duke Ellington people that he knew. And then when the Jazz at Lincoln Center, Ron Westray, you know, Ron, who was here when he had his Clarence had his appearance here. Ron, you know, was like his surrogate son. And I think, where's he down in North Texas now somewhere?
He just got a gig in Austin.
In Austin, right? So he's a kind of and I was out of town when they had his funeral services. But Carolyn McClary made sure I got everything, and that Wynton Marsalis showed up and played. And I said, that in itself, you know, that's kind of like, say no more, in terms of the reach and the impact that he had, you know, as a jazz critic. And that's why I respected him, because there's very few jazz critics out there. I mean, we talk about a J.A. Rogers going back to 1925. Well, you'd be hard-pressed to tick them off, you know, over the years that continued in that tradition. And Clarence certainly, as early as 1940, you know, began to keep his notes about the music and gather all kind of artifacts and memorabilia. He came out of Daytona Beach, out of Florida, and he grew up in a house that had, you know, Mary McLeod Bethune. You may have heard of her. Well, Clarence used to hang with Alfred Bethune Jr. That was his best buddy, running around Mary McLeod Bethune's office. You know, that's where they hung out and played and everything. So coming out of Florida, there's so many very important African Americans, and A. Philip Randolph, you know, you talk about Zora, these people coming out of Florida, James Weldon Johnson out of Jacksonville, kind of like straight up the eastern seaboard. And that was pretty much the passage that Clarence took as he moved into 1900. He says, on several occasions, he said 1935. I've heard anything from 1935 to 1952 in terms of when he arrived in New York. I'm not sure when he did. But he certainly was here to be at Minton's, you know, when in the very crucible of the bebop phase. He was here because he remarks, and in one of my books, The Autobiography of the People, he was working on his autobiography at one time, but I had enough information for him to just go ahead and give me a nice capsule on your nights and days at Minton's Playhouse. So that's what he gave to me, and that's included in my book, The Autobiography of a People.
Okay.
I just should mention that the photos, when you're leaving, if you want to see it these are all the photos of all the events. And on the left there, the first one that goes with the 3 pictures down, the middle one is the Clarence Atkinson. So you should look and see those photos, because that's, frankly, just weeks before he passed.
Yes.
And I should acknowledge, I think there's a lot of, we'll get to our acknowledgments of who's here tonight, but I just want to mention a dear friend of his who was very, very helpful was Deborah Dale.
Yes.
Debbie,
Debbie.
Debbie, wave so everybody knows who you are.
That's right.
She was
Yes.
very, very, very helpful.
Yeah, Deborah and I spent a lot of time together, trying to. She would, I think, Clarence would write these articles because I'm the managing editor at a website called The Black World Today. And even before then, I helped facilitate the placement of a lot of his articles. And he would write them out in longhand, but somebody had to type those things up. Right, Deb?
Okay. We're also going to get to you in a moment. I know some of you want to jump in here. Yeah. But I feel it important to ask you about, you had mentioned before we started, you mentioned again about jazz criticism. And I just want to ask you, and if you could try to we are running under as our friend Plato Ben says, under the tyranny of the clock.
Where is he tonight, by the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Good, he's not here.
No, one time. Hey, he's promoted.
I didn't say that.
He has promoted this show on the radio. I mean, this Harlem Speaks. Okay.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Okay. But I'm going to ask you in this way, and if you can't, try to be brief.
Sure.
I found, this is true in the academy too, with like literature, but I'm talking about in the music. There seems to be in jazz history, from what I've read and talked to musicians about in particular, I'm close to more musicians than I am jazz critics per se, that there's a kind of a presumption on the part of jazz critics over the decades to presume that they are the authorities on the music as opposed to the musicians.
Do you have anybody in mind?
I don't think we have the time to actually go in. I can name one.
Only one.
Really? You really want me to name one? Okay. Let's see.
Don't say it.
Come on, say it.
I'll let. Well, why don't we get some from the audience?
Okay.
What do you think? Oh, you want to name somebody? 'Cause I want to. Oh no, Stanley. Oh no, Stanley. No, Stanley. Stanley doesn't fit that. He gives homage to the musicians. He really does. I mean, he used to play drums. He really gives homage to the musicians. I wouldn't put Stanley in that.
Well, I don't know about that, Greg.
Really?
Because, if you look at the whole history of the JALC thing,
Right.
it's a perception of many folks on the outside is that the Stanley is the brain for Winton, and
Like
that
a boss
Albert
will.
Murray is the brain for Stanley. Right?
Right.
But what I'm saying is that you have the jazz critic here. There's a perception now that you have. In fact, there's one very good book out there you should check out that does a fair job of being nonpartisan in his analysis. He's dead now. He wrote a book called Blue, The Murder of Jazz. Eric Nicholson, right? And Eric talks about the whole history, and of course, who is it, Ted Piazza? Yeah, Tom Piazza. Also, they talk about this whole history of the JALC thing and what was going on there. And what they had gathered in their analysis is that, in fact, the jazz critic had supplanted the musician. That it was, that Winton was pretty much at the dictates, virtually, a marionette to Stanley Crouch's ideological positions and
Do you believe that?
impressions. Well, if you look at what you're going to believe in terms of being, you were on the inside there, right? You were on the
I used to
inside.
write about it for the City Sun.
Exactly. So I'm talking about the perceptions of many people, and of course Eric proposes this to some extent, and trying to analyze the situation, what actually was going on there, and do you have this here kind of continuation from the ideas of Albert Murray right into, of course, now there seems to be a little distance between Mr. Murray and Mr. Crouch. They're not as friendly as they used to be. But at one time you had those three people, Wynton Marsalis, Albert Murray, and Stanley Crouch, as being the prime movers at JALC. Now there's a perception of many people out there who's looking at that situation.
Right, but I feel incumbent to say, because you did say I was on the inside, I feel incumbent to say that one of the, as a young journalist myself in the early 90s, one of the perceptions that I had was that there seemed to be an aspect of this attack that was racial in motivation. That the idea that the three black men that you're talking about were in fact running jazz at Lincoln Center being the preeminent performing arts emporium in the country, was something that some critics, white critics in particular, couldn't countenance.
I know one of those too, Gene Lee's.
New York Post.
Gene Lee's wrote a book called Cats of Any Color,
Right.
Jazz in Black and White,
Right.
in which he castigated me. As a matter of fact, he threw me in the same bag with Stanley Crouch and with Marcellus. I said, whoa, how did that happen? What do I have in common with them?
I think there are some things in common with them.
Oh, yeah, we all black and born in the
No,
South.
no, 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 no. I don't think so. I don't think so.
No, I was just thinking that.
Y'all know each other's